welcome to a new episode of Treasures. Today we're coming to you from a unique place, so stay with us. We're coming to you from the Egyptian Museum of Antiquities. It was inaugurated in 1901 AD. It houses thousands of ancient Egyptian monuments. Today we will be visiting together the Middle Kingdom Gallery, and I'm happy to have with me today our guest. He is Associate Professor and Lecturer of Egyptology, Dr. Mohammed Nabil. Right now we are in the Middle Kingdom Gallery. The Middle Kingdom actually started around 2030 BC, and the founder of it was called Mentuhotep Nebhebet Ra. But actually there are more to know before we speak about the Middle Kingdom. So now, Dr. Muhammad, before we talk about the Middle Kingdom, would you first tell us the chronology of the ancient Egyptian history?
Yes, of course, the ancient Egyptian civilization started roughly in 3100 BC. At that time, Egypt was divided into two lands, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Then one of the kings, his name is Narmer, came from Upper Egypt, and he defeated the people of Lower Egypt, and he started Memphis, or dynasty number one. In the ancient Egyptian civilization, we have 30 dynasties, and we have the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Of course, King Narmer started the unification for the first time. But after the Old Kingdom period of the ancient Egyptian civilization, Egypt had a big decline, which is who started a new civilization, or the Middle Kingdom. If you look at this king, for example, you will see that he is represented in a black color, and he is wearing the crown of the north. If you look at this king, for example, you will see that he is represented in a black color, and he is wearing the crown of the north. Both of the color and the crown is representing and showing us the unification between the both lands, because the black color refers to death, of course, Osiris, and also it shows the southern part of Egypt. But the crown is showing the north. So here he wants to say that he is the king who is coming from the south, and he defeated the people of Lower Egypt. If you look at this beautiful statue, you can see that he is represented in the Osiris form. Once you see the king is represented with the crossed arms like this means that the statue was carved for this king for his death. That's why this statue was found in Luxor in his mortuary temple.
Now, some of our viewers might not know what is a mortuary temple. So would you tell us about how the types of temples present in ancient Egypt?
Yes. There were two types of temples in ancient Egypt. We had cult temples and mortuary temples. The cult temples were dedicated to gods. For example, we have the Karnak temple. We have Luxor temple. Those temples were dedicated to gods, right? The mortuary temples were dedicated to kings. That's why they call them the temples of millions of years, because the ancient Egyptians believed in resurrection. They believed that they will live again in the afterlife. So that's why they built them, these temples, to venerate their cult in the afterlife. So that's why this statue was found in the mortuary temple of Mentuhotep Nebhebet Ra, near to the temple of Queen Hatshepsut.
Now, for the artifacts here in the museum, these are more mortuary or afterlife artifacts. So now, would you tell us a bit about the ancient Egyptian belief in the afterlife and what did they do to make sure that it will be sustained?
One of the main problems faced the ancient Egyptians is how to provide the deceased with everything that he might need in the afterlife. That's why inside the tombs, they started at the very beginning to put real food and drink for them inside jars. But later on, they found out that this is a big problem because they have to go daily to change this. That's why they started to have inscriptions, for example, and this is the Hatib Dinisu formula or the offering formula. When the spirit or when the ka of the deceased reads this formula, everything becomes real, right? So this is actually to overcome this problem. And also, we have something else. Why the ancient Egyptians carved statues for themselves? Basically because the ancient Egyptians had no cameras like today. So these are the pictures or these are the photos of the kings and queens and the noblemen or even the workers. Because the ancient Egyptians believed that the spirit will come after death to identify the facial features of the deceased. So what happens if one of these statues are destroyed? So we have substitutes. So the spirit of the deceased will not be lost. So that's why the ancient Egyptians carved statues to protect the spirit of the deceased.
Now, what is one of the most important features or the characteristic features of the Middle Kingdom?
The art of the Middle Kingdom was completely different because let's look at this statue. If you look at the feet and the legs of this statue, for example, you can see that they are quite big in the proportion of the rest of the body. And you can see that the feet are big, and also if you look at the lips, so you can see that they are bigger than the Old Kingdom. So art in the Middle Kingdom was sitting on the fence, not as good as the art of the Old Kingdom or as precious as the New Kingdom. It has different characteristics. Concerning this statue, for example, you can see it is made of painted sandstone, right? And you can see that he's wearing the crown, you can see the eyes, you can see the Osiris form, and you can see the curved beard. And once we see the curved beard, basically we say that this is death, right? If it is a straight beard, it means that the statue was carved for the king during his lifetime. But also, in the Middle Kingdom, we have different characteristics, like literature, for example. In the Middle Kingdom, we have the coffin texts, right? We have so many different things. In the Middle Kingdom, for example, for the first time, the pharaohs paid great attention to agriculture, right? So that's why they changed their capital from Upper Egypt and they moved to El-Lesht or Atitawi near to El-Fayoum, and they started to use Qattara depression to store water, and they started to cultivate so many beautiful buildings.
Now, if we move to another topic, because here actually the pieces are not placed in chronology, but actually
Yes,
according to items.
Here we have, for example, the statue of Montuhotep Nebhabitra. We have also parts of the enclosure wall of one of the kings of the Middle Kingdom, Snusrit, and you can see that here the scarab is pushing the solar disk. Of course, on the very top we have got Horus, the falcon, and he is crowned by the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. And you can see under the Horus, or under the figure of Horus, you can see the scarab is pushing the solar disk. The scarab in the ancient Egyptian civilization is called Khepr, and Khepr was the god of the sunrise. And here you can see that here he is pushing the sunrise every day. And since it happens in every morning, so it is a sign of eternity.
Now, what about the rest of the enclosure? Like we can see other symbols like the key of life, the Ankh sign, and the Mess sign.
Yes.
So would you talk to us about some of the symbols on it?
You can see the symbol Mess, it is the son of. But you can see the sign of the Ankh. Basically, it refers to the Nile. Mistakenly, we call it the key of life, but it is not the key of life, it is the sign of life, because basically it shows the delta of the Nile. It shows the Nile, which is very long, and it goes down into 9 countries, and you can see the East Bank and the West Bank of Egypt. So the sign of life refers to the Nile, and the Nile is the source of life for the Egyptians. That's why here we have something very special, and you can see on this enclosure wall a representation of God Hapi. And God Hapi is the god of the Nile. And here we can see God Hapi is represented with the profile, and he is wearing a wig, and you can see the curved beard, and you can see that he is represented with the full breast and a tummy, sign of the prosperity of the Nile.
There are certain characteristic features in the shape of the god Hapi. For example, we feel that he seems more like bisexual or female. Yeah. A male with a female body. So would you talk to us a bit about the characteristic features of that god?
Yes, it looks like a female because it's a sign of fertility. You know that the female produces milk, for example, right? Like the cow, right? She is the goddess of love, music, and maternity. Hapi is the god of the Nile, and you can see that he is represented with the tummy and the full breasts. And of course, there were 2 representations of Hapi, because we have the Nile of Upper Egypt and the Nile of Lower Egypt, and you can see this beautiful representation of Hapi in the temple of Phila in Aswan. He is protected by a huge snake, because the snake was the god of protection, to protect the source of the Nile. And you can see here also beautiful signs and representations are representing the key of life, or the sign of life, sorry, which shows the Nile. So that's why this is the Nile. It shows life.
The was scepter?
The was scepter, it's a sign of authority. Even, for example, you can see Waset. Waset is Thebes, because Thebes was the capital of Egypt. And Was is the scepter of power. And of course, it was built during the time of one of the kings. That's why you can see the Was scepter, because it shows and it resembles power.
Now, to the other side here, we can see a statue of a queen. Who's this queen?
So this is one of the queens of the Middle Kingdom, and she is the wife of Senusert II. And you can see a beautiful representation of this queen, that it is made, or the statue is made of black granite. But if you look at the wig, you can see the wig here is completely different, because this is the wig of goddess Hathor, and goddess Hathor was the goddess of love, music, and maternity in the ancient Egyptian civilization. So here the queen resembles and shows love and maternity for the Egyptians. And if you look at this queen, you can see that the eyes supposed to be inlaid or made out of beautiful stones, but they are taken away, and the facial features are clear, and you can see that her both hands are extended, and this shows mercy. For the kings, sometimes you can see that they are having, the fist is clenched, sign of power, right? So, but for women, you can see that their palm is extended, sign of mercy.
Now, I'd like to ask about the ears. I've noticed that actually the statues of the Middle Kingdom have big ears. Is that really true or so?
This is true, because art during the Middle Kingdom was different. So the art during the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom was more delicate. But here in the Middle Kingdom, even before, we have noticed that the feet of Montehotep Nebuchadnezzar is huge in proportion of the rest of the body. But also you can see that the ears are big. Also you can see sometimes that the lips are big, the nose are big, but unfortunately here the nose is destroyed.
Muhammad, flanking us now and behind us we have two columns, and they date to the second intermediate period, but they are exhibited here. Now, would you talk to us about the styles and types of columns we had in ancient Egypt?
Yes. During the time of the ancient Egyptian civilization, mainly there were 2 or 3 types of columns. And these columns are representing the flowers. There were 2 main flowers in ancient Egypt. We had the papyrus and we had the lotus. The papyrus was the symbol of the north, the delta, and even it looks like the delta. And the lotus resembles, or it was planted in Upper Egypt, in the south. So that's why the ancient Egyptians represented the capitals of their columns as if they are the flowers. That's why once you go inside the temples, when you see the columns inside, they are not the columns, but they are the flowers of this temple, but those flowers were made of stones, right? So, for example, here you can see the papyrus flowers representing the closed papyrus flowers, because we have the closed papyrus and the open papyrus as well, and you can see that it resembles and it shows the northern part of Egypt.
Now, were there also some capitals with palm fronds, or not always?
Yes, of course, and we have the composed capitals, because sometimes they put the papyrus and the lotus together. Sometimes even they use the head of goddess Hathor to represent the capital. So we have different types of columns in the ancient Egyptian civilization. It depends on the period itself, because when you go to visit the temples of the Greeks and the Romans, the Greco-Roman temples in Upper Egypt, like Komombo, Phila, Edfu, and those temples, you will see that the columns are different. So when you go to see the columns in the temple of Saqqara, or the complex of Saqqara, so you will see that the columns are different. Even the columns are not freestanding like this, the columns are attached to the walls. So it depends on the architect who decides how to make these statues.
Dr. Muhammad, so actually the coffin text is a development of what is known as the pyramid text, and it has many phases in its or stages in development. So would you talk to us about such a mortuary formula?
Yes, the ancient Egyptians, as we said before, believed in resurrection, and they believed that they will live again in the afterlife. So they had so many books, for example, something that they do believe in. So they had the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and the Book of the Dead. For example, the Book of the Dead has 12 hours. We call them the 12 hours of night. So the deceased has to go through these hours to reach the sunrise. So that's why here we have the magical spells, and the deceased has to read these magical spells in order to go to the afterlife. So, for example, here we have the sarcophagus of one of the priests of the Middle Kingdom, and you can see that it is painted from inside, and you can see the offering formula, and we call it the Hatib Din Su formula, or the offering formula. And then on the second register, you can see that everything that he might need in the afterlife. You can see the neck rest, you can see mirrors, you can see necklaces, you can see earrings, and how impressive to see that earrings were used by men at the time. You can see jars, food and drinks. You can see the bows and arrows, and maybe he was the overseer of the army, and you can see the sandals. From the design here, you can see that they placed the head of the deceased in this direction, and the feet were there, because here we can see the neck rest, and there we can see the sandals. Then, down there, you can see the text is written there. This is to protect the mummy of the deceased. Then you have the sarcophagus to protect the mummy of the deceased. And then right here we can see the 2 eyes of Horus to allow the deceased to see what's happening outside his place. This is to help the spirit, or this is to help the Ka to identify the facial features of the deceased.
Also, I've noticed that actually there are 2 scripts here. There is one in full character and one almost like a type of cursive form.
Yes.
What are these scripts?
So, in the ancient Egyptian civilization, we had different types of writings or scripts. The hieroglyphs, hieratic, and demotic. The The hieroglyphs is the sacred language, and it was the language or the script of the priests. It was very official. Then the hieratic for the priests, and demotic, demos, it's for the commoners and for the people at that time.
So here we have the full script would be the
This is
colorful, the hieroglyph.
The colorful one is the hieroglyphic, and also from the beautiful signs here, we can tell the direction of reading. Because if you notice here, you can see that all the figures are looking to the right side. So in this case, we start reading from the right. The ancient Egyptians were very smart. They had their writings from either left to right or right to left, and sometimes from the top to the bottom. And from the features and from the figures, we can tell which direction is the script.
Then the second one, which is more cursive, that would be the hieratic?
The hieratic, because it is more religious. And
Now,
of course, it's written in columns, and it has different spells. For example, when I say spell number 151B, it talks about the funerary masks, how to protect the deceased and how to protect the facial features, and it has so many spells.
Was it common for the ancient Egyptians to make statues out of wood?
Yes, the ancient Egyptians actually were very skillful to carve statues made of different materials. So we have seen statues made out of stones for the kings, because the stone is more expensive, because they had to do expeditions and campaigns to the desert to bring the blocks and to carve the statues, right? And we have other statues are made out of wood, like this one, for instance, and they were made out of either sycamore wood, and it was a sacred wood. It is the symbol of goddess Hathor, and also the cedar wood, which was brought from Lebanon. But though it is made out of wood, or it was made out of wood, it shows how skillful were the ancient Egyptians to represent their art. If you look at the curly wigs, if you look at the eyes, you can see the facial features, you can see the muscles, you can see the arms, you can see the kilt. And though this statue is destroyed, but it shows the passion of the ancient Egyptians while they were carving their statues. Because let's agree on something, that everyone in the ancient Egyptian civilization had the right to have this statue or this representation, because he wanted to help his ka, or he wanted to help his spirit to come to recognize his facial features. So this was very important for every person to have a statue. So if he cannot make a statue made out of stone, he can make a statue made out of wood and other materials. For example, we have the statue of Pipi is made out of copper, right? So we have different materials which shows the skills of the ancient Egyptians in carving their statues.
Actually, the statue here, the facial features is different. It seems more Nubian. Is that true?
The ancient Egyptians, of course, had mercenaries coming from Nubia, and they served in the Egyptian army, so that's why you can see the facial features. And this is again shows the skillful art of the ancient Egyptians, how they represented their kings, how they represented their queens, how they represented the Egyptian workers, how they represented the African and the Nubian military mercenaries. So it shows the power of art during the Middle Kingdom, though, as we said before, that the characteristics of the Middle Kingdom is different than the Old Kingdom. Back to the statues, for example, you remember that in the Old Kingdom period, we have the statues of the workers. Why the ancient Egyptians made small statues for the workers? Because they wanted those workers to perform the daily activities for them in the afterlife. So that's why they had these small statues. And if you look at the facial features of those workers, you can see that they are different, because they were made for certain people at the time, not just a copy for the workers, but they were showing us different people. For example, back to the statues, the ancient Egyptians were very skillful to represent a small statue for King Cheops, and it was made out of ivory. So again, this shows the power and the skills of the ancient Egyptians to carve statues made out of ivory for 7.5 centimeters.
Today we have viewed together part of the gallery of the Middle Kingdom at the Egyptian Museum of Antiquities. We learned how the Middle Kingdom started, who unified Egypt after a long period of decline. We also looked into the art and religious beliefs of that period. And by this we come to an end of this episode of Treasures. Until then, in another place and another treasure, it's goodbye.